Okay, what's up guys? This is Fringe, and I got another tutorial for you. It's this one's detailing layer effects and layer styles and creating some really nice professional text using layer effects and layer styles like you can see here. This is what we're going to create in this tutorial. This really nice professional sleek text with nice highlights and shadows, and you can see if you double click on the layer tutorial in a empty spot of it, you can see it involves about 6 or 5, depending on if you consider contour a layer effect, but about 6 layer effects. So now we're going to start from scratch on this one, so just hit Control N or go up to File, New, Control N on PC of course. And I'm making it 1920 by 1080. You can make it whatever you want, although if you want to have the same scaling for the layer effects as me, it has to be at least 700 pixels wide, and then just make sure background is transparent, RGB color, all the rest, blah blah blah. I'm going to call this tutorial. And now we're on layer 1 here. Double click on the name, rename it to background, and then just go ahead and hit shift backspace or go up to edit, fill, same thing, shift backspace, and choose color, not any of the others, color, and make sure you have a brightness of 20 and saturation and hue all the way down to 0, so you have a nice dark gray, and everything else regular and normal 100%, blah blah blah. And now you have a nice background. So then go up to your text tool, horizontal type tool, or you can hit T to get the tool. And I'm using this one right here, this font right here, Bank Gothic LTBT. It's a really nice one. You can use any, simple and straight edged, very straight edged text. And I'm going to use a font of around 230, around there. Let's see how it goes. I'm going to type in tutorial. Oops. And seems pretty good right there. Just keep it black for now. Text black, text color. Align left is fine, it really doesn't matter. Strong anti-aliasing. And now you can just hit Control Enter to accept that, or Enter on the keypad, or just click off. And now to access your layer effects, you can go down to here to Effects and choose one. You can hit Control Shift O to bring up the blending options, which has the layer effects. You can go to Layer, or not Layer, Layer Style, Blending Options, or choose one. Or you can just double click right here, which is what I usually do. Just double click, and we're going to start with a nice drop shadow. Take the distance to 0, the opacity to 100, and the size to about 8. And keep multiplying black as the color. And then go over to gradient overlay, which makes fills the text with a gradient, or fills the layer with a gradient. Drop shadow just makes a nice shadow. Make sure your layer knocks out drop shadows on, or else if you took the fill opacity down, then you'd see the drop shadow. Of course you can't see anything because gradient overlay is on. And we're just going to have this, make sure the angle's 90, linear, take the size all the way up so there's not so much black at the bottom, and the rest just keep the same, black to white gradient. And now go over to color overlay, which fills the layer with a color, and you can set your blending options, all that, but we're just going to make it white, color white, and take the opacity down to 30%, so you just get a nice simple gradient. Oh yeah, and go over to the gradient and change this white slider to change the brightness to 70. That just makes a nice simple mid-gray to light gray gradient overall with these two combined. You could always not have the color overlay and just change the black and the gradient, but I just find it's easier to just use a color overlay. Then go to Bevel and Emboss, and Bevel and Emboss makes shadows and highlights around the edges of the layer or text. I'm hitting Control plus to zoom in, but it makes edges around the layer or text so that you can so that it appears to be 3D-ish, and it just jumps out at you. And style is where the bevel or emboss is going to be located. Outer bevel is outside. Emboss is kind of on the edge, like centered. Stroke does it to the stroke, but you can't see anything because there's no stroke. We're just going to keep inner bevel. And technique is how the bevel actually is cut. So smooth gives you smooth edges, chisel hard gives you hard, and soft will give you kind of a chiseled round edges. If it's not round, then you won't see any difference between chisel hard and chisel soft. Just keep it at chisel hard so you get a nice chiseled look. And now the most important thing besides these other options is gloss contour. This defines how the shadows and highlights look, interact with each other. Just click this pop-up box and choose this one right here. It's a really nice one. It gives you some really nice results, some really soft results. And the other ones are really good. I've made some custom metal ones right here, but just keep this one and I'll show you how this is working. On the right here, if you double click on the contour, you have the highlights on the shadows on the left and the highlights on the right. And as you can see, when I actually chose this one, chose Bevel and Emboss, it got slightly darker over all the text. That's because this represents the middle of the text, the default color. I took it, or the contour took this point down, the middle point, so it actually got darker overall. The highlights are fairly white, if you can see as I change this. And like if I take the set shadows up, shadows get lighter, take them down, they get darker. But I'm just going to cancel out of that to keep that default one. Turn on anti-aliasing. Now before we mess with these things, turn on contour, go over to depth, which is how I would say how dark and how light the shadows and highlights are. Take it all the way to 1000. You're not going to see much on this specific contour. Take it all the way down, and obviously there's very little depth and you can't really see much. You go over to contour, hit anti-alias, keep the regular contour, and go up to range. Now while this bevel and emboss applies to the whole layer, contour applies to the bevel and emboss. It applies a custom contour to the bevel and emboss, but it works the same way besides that. And take the size down to 2, which is obviously just how big the bevel and emboss is. Keep the highlight and shadow modes at screen and multiply, which is just how the highlights and shadows are working. Take the opacity of the highlight mode to 30 and the opacity of the shadow mode to about 90 works well. And now we're just going to give it a light inner glow just to make it punch a little bit, which inner glow just obviously it's basically the same thing as inner shadow, except it's omnidirectional, which means that it comes out on every side equally. Like if you used inner shadow with 0 distance, it's the exact same thing pretty much. Just take the size up to around 13 and change the blend mode from screen to color dodge, which will have a more sculpted and brighter effect. And then take the opacity down to 15, so it's just a slight punch. And that is it right there. A very nice, simple, professional effect. As you can see, if we hit Control Tab to go back go to the next window, which is back in this case, pretty much looks the exact same, and it looks a really nice professional look. You can add textures to this to make it look like a unique effect and other things. Actually, I'll just tell you about the other layer effects that you can apply. Inner shadow applies the same thing as an inner glow, which is just a light edge effect, edged color effect, But you can also do omnidirectional, i.e. you can change the distance and make it come from one way or the other. You can change the angle. Global light determines the overall light, so if you move it around right now, if you had other stuff in the image, it would move their bevel and emboss too, or their inner shadow, or their drop shadow too. Let's just cancel out of that and go back in. Or you can hit Alt, which automatically changes the cancel button to reset. And direction in bevel and emboss determines where the shadows and where the highlights are. It just automatically reverses it. So if you wanted to say like a chisel look out of the background, then you might use this to come up with that kind of look. Texture can add texture to the actual layer in the form of bevel and emboss. So basically, if I change the contour now, I'll get different texture results. And you can modify the depth, which is how much punch it has. Negative is basically inversing it, and scale is obviously how big the texture is. And hit Alt and reset, which just goes back to what you already had before, not all the way back to your defaults. Pattern overlay, just same thing as gradient and color overlay, where you can modify the blend mode and just fills the whole layer, but it uses patterns instead of gradients or colors or solid colors. You won't see anything in this case because gradient overlay has a blend mode of normal and opacity of 100%. But if I lower that opacity, you can see that I'm applying a pattern. I can take the scale down. Well, let's go ahead and Alt reset that again. And stroke just applies a nice edged color depending on your size and of course your position. Inside you can just fill it basically. And opacity, you can also use color, you can use gradient as a stroke, you can use a pattern as a stroke, any of those. A stroke can be really helpful for a lot of different effects. Like you can make some nice 2D-ish text with a bunch of the different things. And that's about it. Satin applies this sort of, it takes the text and it bends it and warps it to give it a nice shadow or glow depending on the blend mode and opacity and color. But it's not really an effect that you're going to use much because it's just, maybe you could generate some random shadow highlights by changing the contour and stuff of how it bends the layer and all that, but we don't really use satin too much. It's not very helpful. As I said, with these things you can create a bunch of different effects. You can see the layer styles that I've made here, which are just the combination of all the layer effects. I've made like a water one, which doesn't really appear like water with text, but Control Z that. Made a really nice 2D one, which I utilized on my background, which this is just made from a bunch of drop shadows, inner shadows, outer glows, all set to a spread or choke of 100%. Control Z that. And you got different ones that I've made here, or I have different ones. You won't have these. It's like a nice metal one, another nice metal one, all sorts of different ones. These layer styles you can just make by when you've made something or not made something, you just hit new style, or when you're in the style window, you just go to an empty space and you'll see this paint bucket and you just click and you make a new style. I'm going to call this style sleek text, and make sure both of these are on because you might as well just include both of them. There's really no reason why not to. And there you go. That's layer effects and layer styles and sleek professional text for you guys. See you in the next tutorial, and I'll have a really epic speed art out here soon.